So, hello everybody. I'm Jon Slade. I'm one of the talking heads up at the top of your screen. I'm this one, the one that's waving. Um, I'm Jon Slade. I'm from Campbell Tickell, and I guess the way to think of me today in terms of this webinar is as your tour guide. I'm going to try and keep us moving along at the right speed and introducing some people who are far more interesting than me. Sustainability is big and complicated and long term. And that's a combination that can make it seem difficult to interact with, but it's an issue that cannot be dodged and which needs to find a home in every board's business. Zenas, the next slide. Over the course of the next, thank you very much. Over the course of the next hour and a quarter, you're going to hear from three people, from Adam, Broadway, Emma Davies and Julian Beaney. There's going to be a Q&A at the end, and then I'm going to try and tie it all up in a pretty bow at the very end. Just some guidelines, as you would expect for this sort of thing. We are recording the webinar, and it will be made available soon after the event, together with a PDF of the slide pack. You can put captions on for yourself if you'd like to follow with subtitles. Please can you use the Q&A function, which we'll monitor as we go along. And within that function, you can also like or upvote someone else's question, which will tell us that it's a popular question. You can also comment on other people's questions. We'll answer as many of the questions as we can, but we can't guarantee that we'll be able to answer all of them. And we have got visibility of the questions that were submitted in advance. So thank you for those. Participants should be on mute, and there is no video function for those of you who are attending rather than presenting. However, you should be able to see all of us. The point about questions I've already mentioned. And at the end, as you leave, there will be a feedback survey, and it would be really helpful to us if you were able to answer that. So, with those preambles out of the way, on to our first speaker, Adam Broadway. Adam has two main strings to his bow. He's many years of experience developing new properties and schemes, and an adjacent practice in the role of sustainability, both in new developments and more broadly in how housing businesses do business. Adam is going to offer some thoughts on why sustainability issues matter. So Adam, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, John, for the introduction. This is a really fascinating subject, and I was delighted to be invited by John and colleagues to come along. So my role in this is really to put on the table a number of kind of key issues and facts which are driving what is, as John has said, is a complex and often conflicting topic around sustainability. But I wanted to start by going straight to the point that this conversation is about sustainability and not carbon. And the reason we say this is that a number of organisations have got quite focused on collecting carbon data and carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are clearly very important in that they are a significant contributor to climate change, but they're not the only thing. And that's why you'll also hear about things called net zero and carbon greenhouse gas emissions neutrality and things like this. All kind of jargon, all kind of making it very kind of complicated. But what we're trying to do is to kind of help you unwrap it, because as organizations who have houses, people, customers, it's really important that we get a big grip on it, because our climate is changing and changing quite rapidly. Next slide, please. So one of the starting points that you may be familiar with is trying to understand sustainability, but looking at what we call the three pillars. So a lot of the focus has always been around the environment, about the issues around energy, water, biodiversity, um, things like that, things which are quite evident when we look at places, look at the news, etc. But what's also important is that in terms of sustainability, we also need to kind of think about the social aspects of this, about the issues about equity, about things like fuel poverty, about people, and the issues around kind of resources and sharing. But all of that is fine. But if you need to do it and consider obviously the financial implications. And it's for those who've been in this kind of subject area for quite some time, it's been said for a very long time that to address climate change is going to cost. There's no hiding behind that. But the later you do it, and later we as individuals or in organizations do it, it's going to cost a lot more. And I think it's fair to say that some of the economic points have probably been one of the contributors to some organisations taking up the debate at a lower pace. We have significant pressures, don't we, in the housing world, and adding sustainability to it can actually feel quite frightening and challenging financially. But it's important to do it, and we are making the case that actually organisations need to think about this rounded subject of sustainability within the three pillars as per the slide. Next slide, please. So all of this, why is this really important? Well, one of the really important points to make is this whole point about world temperatures. And this graph here is just trying to show you how over a period of time the average global temperature has significantly increased from the pre-industrial average in the early kind of 1900s. And the question then is kind of why, and what the probably 2000 most senior academics and researchers in this field are absolutely adamant is that industrialization, man-made industrialization, for all the benefits it has also brought us a consequence in that burning fossil fuels has basically increased the global temperature of our world. And that has significant impacts, as we are probably very alert to. If you watched the news last night, you had two incredibly different scenarios. You had Portugal on fire and you had Poland flooded. All of the temperature and weather impacts are all highly related to climate change. And this is one of the critical things we need to be considering, not just as individuals, but also as organizations. So how do we try and limit this? Because the impacts of it are pretty unknown and could be significantly more severe than we're seeing at the moment. Next slide, please. So one of the big headlines, which you may well have heard about, is this whole thing about trying to keep the temperature increase at 1.5 degrees centigrade. That is the global target that the UN conference, a framework of Convention of Climate Change experts are trying to get us all to participate in. Because if we carry on over that target, and it's not a target we want to hit, but have a significant chance of going over, we will tip the world's weather in particular out of control, and we don't know what that will do. And this is the critical point. Now, a lot of people will say, well, this is a global problem. Why does it affect me? Why does my organization have to do it? And I think the blunt answer is if we don't play our part, then we do not know what the world is going to be like for our children and our children's children. We're going to tip something out of balance, and that will have significant implications for us as humans and for society or our business that we're in at the moment. And this is really relevant, I think, in terms of organizations like housing and board members where this issue is very, very important and needs to be considered. Next slide, please. So what are some of the effects? We've got 4 images on here. Again, a lot of this is probably very familiar to people, but I think it's quite startling. The iceberg debate, or the picture of the polar bear stranded on an iceberg, is really, really important, because what we are seeing is significant iceberg melts, which are basically significantly raising the water levels across the globe. About 40% of the ice in Greenland in particular has gone. And if we carry on like this, by the end of the century, we could see the sea level rises and temperature of the sea rise. And the depth, the increase of height was probably about 2 feet, which will put a number of significant cities around the world underwater. On the right-hand side, flooding. It's costing us probably about £700 million in insurance claims to deal in the UK with the effects of flooding. We will have policies, we're going to see premiums rises, but also is the social disruption and all the things that relate to having to deal with flooding and making it very difficult for a number of places to be habited. The sea, coral reef has the main reefs have probably declined by about 50% between 1957 and about 2007. If we continue to do this, then we're actually taking a major suction pump, as it were, out of the system. The suction pump being taking the carbon which we're emitting and taking it back into the seas and to the ground. There's lots of complicated reasons why this is happening, but again, by not managing this in a proper way, we are causing significant problems for the future. And then we get things like droughts. We're seeing significant numbers of droughts, and the important thing I think relating to this is that droughts will not only cause poverty and food issues, but they will cause people to migrate. And the migration point is significant, because people will have to move out of certain areas around the globe to find accommodation, food and water. And again, that has significant social and economic impacts on those countries and those individuals. Next slide, please. So as I say, we are at some of the tipping points of some of these issues relating to climate change and the wider issues around kind of sustainability. As I say, migration is very likely, and there are a number of as you can, if you look at some of the world news, places like Bangladesh, parts of Africa are under significant pressure due to droughts and I say the lack of the ability to kind of grow crops, etc., making people move. Deforestation, again, probably one of the topics that we're all have seen. We've seen what the effects have been on the Amazon, and there are lots of reasons why deforestation has taken place. But if we continue to do this, we're taking again out of the system a suction pump to mop up the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. And then again, the thing about the loss of food production will have significant impacts on individuals and communities around the world, as we have to think very differently about how we source our food and what type of food that we have. Next slide, please. But besides climate change, which is a critical part of the topic, there's a whole debate about resources. We have 3 planets on the screen here. As you can probably understand, we only live on one. But at the moment, if you take all the kind of elements of resources, so food, water, minerals, etc., if you were in America, you would need 5 of these. Europe is probably trading around about 3. the UK about 2.6, and India, for instance, a developing country with a very large population, is around about 0.7. The point is, we do not have enough resources to continue our current lifestyles and the development that we all expect and want within the resources that this planet can actually control and deliver. So we need to think really differently about how we use resources, and particularly around things around recycling, stopping waste, all these complicated topic items, but they're really important because they all contribute to this kind of wider subject matter. Next slide, please. So taking it to the individual level, and this does focus on carbon emissions, but this is a slide I've been using for quite some time. And the point being is that I started to look at the subject, a lot of people were very focused on energy, on heating and cooling buildings and things like this. But as you can see here, if you think about the average lifestyle of somebody in the UK, their carbon impact is actually comprising of a whole series of different elements, of which domestic energy use, for example, is only about 23% of your carbon impact. So this is really important because as a business and an individual, if you want to reduce your carbon, you need to be thinking about where else do you have a hit. And as you can see on this slide, things like goods, including the movement and packaging and processing of food, things like food and resources, and that contributes to around about 40% of our carbon impact. So this is where it gets complicated, and I respect that. But actually, this wider understanding of how carbon and greenhouse gases and the use of resources are really important, particularly in a business. You need to understand what are your major impactors, and therefore come up with strategies which actually help to minimize them in a different way. Next slide, please. So we need
About 4 more minutes, please, Adam.
Yeah, so a few ending slides here. What's important is that there's been a significant change in, for example, in the use of renewables. The current new government is clearly on this agenda, and we're now at a point where a number of our sources of energy are coming from renewable sources, which is a massive bonus. Next slide. And a good example is, for example, the use and the purchase of electric vehicles. Very expensive only about 5-10 years ago. Now actually much more prominent and available to people. We need new systems of charging to be put in place. So we need an improved strategy and system across the UK to encourage people and give them comfort that they can travel more. But a huge number of organisations now have made the switch. Amazon, Post Office, all using electric vehicles as ways of doing their business as normal. Next slide. So what's it got to do with housing? Well, a hell of a lot. I said at the beginning, as board members and people involved in organisations, there are probably critically 3 key things. You have properties. A number of the properties are going to be are needing investment. They're going to need insulation. They're going to need renewable energy systems put in. But also you've got customers. Significant rise in fuel poverty, as we've seen due to the cost of living issues over recent couple of years, all compound the issues for the individual customer. And then you've got staff. So I've got colleagues on here who work for organisations. Again, all these are complicated issues that need to be considered as a board member within an organisation. Next slide. So what I would leave you with on this slide, and to take this way, is that there are significant benefits in addressing the sustainability debate within an organisation under the 3 pillars here. And I'll leave you with those to take away and have a consideration. But what is really important is, besides addressing the renewables and carbon issues, The social ones are really important about sharing health, addressing fuel security, and all of this can be done economically by addressing issues of running costs, making it more affordable for the customers to live in properties securely, etc. And all of that can be done within the capacity and the structure of a sustainability business. Next slide, please. There are, as they're coming through here, all this is to say is that we're not alone. A number of the private organisations listed here have all adopted really sophisticated sustainability strategies relevant to their business. And I think that's the critical thing I would say here, is that all of this debate needs to be very specific to your organisation, but embedding it as a part of your business as usual can be done, is being done, and actually gets you the benefits for your customers, your properties, and your staff and partners and suppliers. Next slide. There are lots of things to go away and think about as individuals and things here. All I would, again, just remind ourselves on that significant progress has been made and is being made. And now is really the time that if you haven't addressed the subject at a board level, now is the time to do it. There is lots of things in terms of resources, experience, good practice out there which can help you. And we, most importantly, encourage people to give this serious consideration, bear in mind all the other pressures. But adopting a sustainability strategy within the business is the way forward. Thank you.
I'm chuntering away there, as though you can hear me when you couldn't. So thank you very much, Adam. Apologies for rushing you towards the end there. Next up, we've got Emma Davies. Emma has two highly pertinent perspectives to talk from. During the day, she's Principal Sustainability Officer at Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service, seeking to maximise the sustainability outcomes within new developments in Cambridge. Emma is also a board member at the Good Homes Alliance. She will tell you more about who they are, but it's fair to say it could not be more on the money for the subject matter we're talking about today. So Emma, over to you.
Thank you, John. And yeah, as John says, I'm kind of going to be talking with two hats on today. And if we move to the first slide, I'll first of all talk with my Good Homes Alliance board member hat on. So who are we? So the Good Homes Alliance, we are a not-for-profit community interest company. We've got over 125 member organisations from across the built environment sector. And our focus is to seek to go beyond business as usual and collaborate to deliver homes fit for the 21st century. So as you can see from this slide, our focus is on enhancing the health impacts and performance primarily of new build homes. And believe me, we've had quite a lot of debate in on the board about whether we bring retrofit into that. But I think we've decided that we're going to focus on new build because there's a lot of other kind of retrofit organisations out there. And our view is that if we can improve the standard of new build housing, it sounds like it's focused very much on the kind of environmental performance of new homes, and a lot of our work is. But if we can get that right, that will deliver a wide range of benefits from a kind of responding to climate perspective, not just in terms of environmental sustainability, but also social and economic sustainability. So as I mentioned, we are a member organisation, and as our board is basically made up of representatives of each category of membership that we have. So we've got developers on the board, we have architects, there's myself kind of representing local authorities, and we've also got representation from housing associations. And this ensures that we get a broad range of views when we're developing projects and working on things like our manifesto and our mission statement. which brings me nicely onto our next slide, which kind of highlights the key elements of our mission statement, really, and what we consider are the key things that can be done to catalyse delivery of high-performance net zero homes and places which enable happy and healthy lives. So it's not just about buildings, but it's about places as well. So this mission statement and the elements within it, we have developed this in consultation with our members. And one of the things that we ask our members to do is to help support delivery of that mission statement through the work that they do, focusing on one or two key areas of the statement. And as you can see from the slide, I'm not going to go through it all because that would be death by PowerPoint, but we've got a range of different elements in the mission statement. We're looking at operational energy and water. We refer to whole life carbon here, healthy adaptive homes as well, recognizing that climate change is going to happen. So we are going to have to adapt to a degree of change in our climate. Attractive homes, we've got work streams related to biodiversity as well. And I suppose, you know, what we try and do really, we have a wide variety of work streams happening at the moment that seek to deliver elements of this mission statement. So we've got networks set up. We have one for local authorities. We've got a network from housing associations. And those networks really are in place so that we can learn from one another and we can kind of share best practice and learning. We've done work on alternative housing models and sources of innovative funding. We've developed toolkits, which are really, really helpful toolkits related to reducing overheating risk in homes. So we've got one toolkit for new homes, and we've also got a toolkit for existing homes. So how, when you're looking to retrofit existing stock, you can also take into account of minimizing the risk of overheating, which is something that we're seeing more and more of now with our changing climate. We've also been doing quite a lot of work recently with other like-minded organisations trying to campaign for a better future homes standard in light of the consultation that happened on that just before the election. For quite a small organisation, we have got quite a lot of areas where we're working on to try and deliver high performance net zero homes. So we do try and develop as many resources and tools that can be used by our members and other organisations to help them on their journey to delivering good homes. So one example which might be of interest is we've got a set of free to download model employers requirements and design brief clauses, which look at performance standards for things like energy, emissions, health, comfort, and building performance evaluation, which is a really important element. Kind of, we can construct all these amazing standards, but knowing that we're actually delivering levels of performance in line with design standards is really important. And we're also about to start up some work on delivering enhanced water efficiency standards. Certainly where I work across Greater Cambridge, water scarcity is a critical issue for us. So yeah, lots of work going on in relation to how we can actually deliver some of those enhanced standards of water efficiency. So if you're sitting there wondering where on earth do we start with this journey, this could well be an area where the Good Homes Alliance might be able to help you and perhaps inspire you through some of the work that our members are already carrying out. So if we move on to my next slide, and I'm now going to change hats. So I'm going to kind of swap over now to my day job, which is, as Jon mentioned earlier on, I work within an incredibly busy local planning authority, working across two authority areas, so Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire. And one of the key parts of my day job is to try and work out how best to tackle the climate emergency through the planning system, which can at times be a bit of a minefield, but I think we're getting there. So one of our key drivers is that both of the authorities that I work for have declared climate emergencies. We have also both declared biodiversity emergencies. And as part of those declarations, our councillors were very, very clear that one of our priority areas was ensuring that growth in our area responded to the climate emergency and delivered net zero. And that's partly in response to the fact that we have got very high levels of growth in our area. And we've also had a really strong steer from our existing residents that for them to be able to support growth, they wanted it to be of the highest possible quality, and quality not just in terms of design standards, but also sustainability standards. So we've developed all sorts of kind of new emerging policies. This slide focuses in on the new metrics that we've been developing for net zero buildings. And for any of you on the call who are familiar with things like Passive House and the work of Letty, these kind of standards won't be new to you. They're being used by quite a lot of other local planning authorities as well. And these standards are all about driving down energy demand in buildings using metrics around space heating and energy use intensity. And then you start to think about renewable energy provision and decarbonisation of the grid, which is quite a big issue for us in Greater Cambridge because a lot of decarbonisation happening, but our grid is also at capacity in quite a lot of areas at the moment. So if we can design new buildings that are low energy, that will help to reduce some of that pressure on the grid and will hopefully help to reduce some of the costs associated with upgrading our grid. So as I say, this slide just highlights some of these new key performance indicators. We are doing a lot of work on other policy areas as well linked to sustainability. So water efficiency is another key area for us where we're looking at enhanced policy requirements for water. Urban heat island is an issue that is coming up in a lot of the work that I do. So this idea of greening new developments so that they are better able to cope with extreme temperatures. We're also doing some work on carbon sequestration as well, which is quite a new area for planning and one that I'm still trying to get my head around. But as I say, I think we've got a very clear drivers, both from our councillors and from our residents, that they want to see our kind of future development being delivered at the highest standards of sustainability possible. And then if we move on to my final slide, we as a local authority, both Cambridge City Council and South Cambridgeshire, are also now building new housing. So in Cambridge, we've got a housing development agency set up, so delivering new affordable housing, but also market housing as well. And one of the ways that our housing development agency have been looking to enhance the environmental performance and address fuel poverty issues has been to build new affordable housing, working towards kind of Passive House. So we've got some schemes that have been certified to Passive House, and then we've got other schemes that have kind of been testing how we get to those kind of Passive House standards. Now, we had quite a lot of debate about this when we first started this work, and to help inform the decision to take the route, consultants were procured back in 2021, I think it was, to carry out some life cycle costing for the Housing Development Agency. So they looked at 4 options for operational energy standards, which are shown on this slide. And I apologise that the resolution isn't that great. This was the best image that I could find. But they've looked at our existing local plan requirements, which are, let's face it, fairly basic. I wrote those requirements back in 2011, so they're a little bit out of date now. They looked at a local plan plus option, which is where you have high levels of energy efficiency and use heat pumps for hot water with some photovoltaic generation as well. They then looked at Passive House certification, and then they also looked at a net zero carbon on-site kind of standard, which is essentially Passive House, but with additional battery storage as well. And what they assessed was they looked at the capital cost uplift, but they also looked at typical maintenance costs and the annual energy costs to our residents. And the slide provides a summary of the costs associated with each of the kind of energy standards that they looked at. And basically what this helped us to kind of demonstrate to councillors was actually the value of building to those higher standards in terms of reducing fuel costs for our residents, and what that could do in terms of helping to reduce things like rent arrears as well as benefiting the health and well-being of our residents. So this is a significant factor for us in deciding to build or start to work towards kind of passive house levels of performance. And one of the other benefits that we found was actually in relation to kind of maintenance costs. And what we want to do with maintenance costs here is keep these under review, because I think what we will find is that these maintenance costs are actually going to come down. And because you're building, if you're looking at working towards passive house or low carbon construction, a lot of the key benefits of that in terms of reducing energy demand is locked into the fabric of the home. So you're not always having to rely on quite complex systems to help support. So because you're then relying on simpler heating and hot water systems, that helps to reduce complexity for our residents, but also importantly for our maintenance teams. So this was going to be another key factor influencing the decision. So I think a key take home from me for this work is, if you are kind of grappling with, should we be building to higher standards, I would definitely say that there is real value in working with cost consultants who are familiar with things like passive house, and then taking that kind of whole life costing approach, so that you're making decisions not just on the basis of that uplift in capital cost, which might actually come down over time as you get more familiar with building to these standards, but also looking at those fuel costs and ongoing maintenance costs. I've seen some figures recently which suggest that if the Future Homes Standard as it's currently defined, if that comes forward, that could lead to an increase in fuel bills of around £1,200 to £1,300, which is a lot of money at a time of very high energy prices. So yeah, I think that's a key take home from me. I think what I would say, we are now updating this work at the moment. I say we, that's the royal we. The Housing Development Agency are updating their kind of standards that they build to, and they're actually looking at developing what's being referred to as the Cambridge Housing Standard, which is going to be building on lessons learnt from the last few years of us actually bringing things forward to passive house and other low carbon construction schemes. So something to keep an eye on. And I think that is it for me.
Emma, that's really useful. Thank you very much. Just before we go on to Julian, just a question from me, if I may, to you, Emma. You're an expert in these matters, and you will often be faced with people who are interested but not expert, and it's easy for the complexity of the subject matter to put people off. What successful ways have you seen of enabling those interested non-experts to find their way into the subject?
I think one of the most beneficial things out there, actually, and I would say I've learned most of this stuff through learning on the job. I'm not an architect or anything, so I've learned as I've gone along. And I think for me, one of the most helpful things I've found is going out and visiting schemes that have built to these sorts of standards, talking to residents who are living in these sorts of homes to get their feedback, because that is really, really valuable to actually, to go into a passive house, to speak to people who are benefiting from living in a passive house. And, there's lots of, the Passive House Trust, for example, can help facilitate that sort of thing. I know lots of cities in the UK have kind of open eco home type events as well, where you can go along and kind of see low carbon homes. They're not all built to passive house. They're, others are built to other different standards. But I think actually learning from schemes that are already out there. We've got lots of case studies on the Good Homes Alliance website as well. So I think having a look at case studies, getting in touch with authorities who are already doing these things and talking to them can be a really helpful way of demystifying what can appear to be quite complex.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you to those of you who are making questions and observations in the Q&A channel. I'm keeping an eye on those together with the questions that were submitted in advance, and at the end we'll get through as many of those as we can. So our third speaker is Julian Beaney. Julian is the Business Services Director at Orbit, a housing association with 47,000 affordable homes in the Midlands, East and South East of England. During the day, Julian's responsibilities include sustainability. So on the subject, he deals with Orbit's board as an officer. And wearing another hat, he's a board member at Tum Housing Association. So he's well positioned to talk about the board interactions with the subject of sustainability. So Julian, over to you.
Thanks very much, John. So I'm hopefully going to get us in time for our questions. I think my first run through of this subject, I think, took about 2.5 hours. So I'm going to try and condense all that into 10 minutes because there's so much we need to talk about. And I just actually, to answer your question, I'm definitely interested in this subject. I did a geography degree, but there's so much I've had to learn in the 4 or 5 years I've had dealing with this. And my daughter's now doing a environmental science degree at York, so she's often my phone a friend when I need a bit of guidance. So next slide, please. Adam gave a really good overview of this, so I just wanted to remind us, and it was a really good question from Suzanne on the panel, that this is happening now. This isn't about kind of, it might happen in the future. We have to do something about this now, and climate change is impacting our businesses, but it's not just about businesses, it's about our customers. This is a people issue. We will have warmer, wetter winters. We will have hotter, dry summers, more frequent and intense weather extremes. And I'll talk later about not only are we trying to mitigate that through the decarbonisation programs, but we've got to adapt to that, and we've got to adapt to that pretty quickly. It is actually, though, and people, I think sustainability can be something that people think, well, that is mañana, that it is tomorrow. But if you think about DMC as one of the critical issues we've been dealing with, if we had those homes that Emma talked about, we wouldn't have a DMC crisis, and we wouldn't actually have an energy cost crisis as well, because it would be cheaper for our customers as well. If you want to know how this is going to affect you, just a bit of a tip, because I think part of this is our own self-exploration and how we learn as board members or as executives. If you go to the BBC website, there's loads of really good stuff on there, but you can see the impact of climate change in your local area. Put in your local postcode, you can find that. So that's one thing for you to do after this session, not during it, please. Right, next slide, please. And I think this is a challenge I think actually we have as board members and senior leaders within our business. We are looking at horizons of 2050 and beyond, and it's really incumbent on us setting that out and not expecting a new or future generation to deal with it. I think Suzanne's point on there is probably absolutely correct. Actually, I think climate change, let's be stark about it, will be a killer for some people, in the shorter term rather than longer term, particularly if we look at this on a global basis as well. So absolutely, we have to do something about it. And we know our homes and our households, absolutely, as Adam said, play a really key part and do this. So it is important we do this, but it's important that we as housing professionals build up this knowledge as well, because we're going to have people on our boards and exec that have got customer, property, technology, finance, repairs expertise. How many actually have a sustainability expertise and background? And I think that's a subject I think we need to ask ourselves. Right, next slide, please. So I'm just going to try and give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour through Orbit's journey. And Orbit's been looking at sustainability for some time, and we've had a sustainability strategy well before this slide. And actually, I think one of the things we're really proud of is our environmental sustainability part of this journey, actually called Orbit Earth, was actually set up by some really keen and vociferous frontline colleagues who really wanted to make sure that Orbit took that action, which is absolutely brilliant. We've now, I guess, tried to put it into the way we work. So you'll see I'll talk through these three elements, both our net zero roadmap, our sustainability strategy, and our corporate strategy. Yeah, please move on to the next slide. I think we're thinking today about what practical things we can do. We do need to have, and I know it's hard to get away from carbon, but we do need to talk about decarbonisation. We do need to talk about, do we have a plan to get from today to 2050 or before? And that's going to be the challenge for all of us, because 2050 may be too far in the future, to enable to be net zero and net zero carbon for our housing and supply chain. That makes up the vast majority of our carbon footprint. If you're looking at the scale of it for Orbit, that is by far the biggest area. And it's, we've done some modelling on this, we've done some analysis. We know as under new consumer regulations, we need to understand our homes. So you can do the modelling of this. We're going to be over £500 million of additional funding needed on top of our normal capital and plan maintenance programs. I think the other thing is, and I'm conscious about some of the language here, scope 1, 2 and 3. If you don't know what that is, I'm going to try and explain it on this very short section, but do go away, because I think certainly scope 1 and 2 are the things within our own operations, our own control. These are our offices, this is our fleet, this is our sheltered schemes, it's our communal areas, it's our sales offices. These are the things we can do. Carbon footprint must be much smaller, but it really sends a really strong signal. And you saw Adam show all these different organizations and their plans, and I think we can do that as well. Scope 2 is electric, so obviously if you're buying renewable energy, that you pretty much deal with that. It's the gas, obviously, that's the thing we need to work hard on. But we've set these two objectives by 2030 for scope 1 and 2, and scope 3 by 2050. But there you are. That's a bit of jargon you'll have to investigate under your own. Let's move on, please. I think it is important, and I think Jon made this point really well, that we don't just default to environmental sustainability, but sustainability as a package. And I think we have to look at the social impact of this. They're absolutely intertwined, and we've got to look at the economic linkages as well. So if you go onto our website, you can download our sustainability strategy, and actually a plug later on today, our annual report, sustainability annual report, will be downloaded. So if you want to really find out the facts about Orbit, then you can go on there and see our performance over the last year. You can see the commitments we've made and our progress against it. We've set some very ambitious, wider targets around our social agenda, social value, £100 million of social value, over the last few years to 2026, and that things, really tough issues like gender and ethnicity pay gap. How do we try and close those gaps? These are not easy things, but we have a broad agenda. But it's important we do think about this on a wider sphere. Next slide, please. I think what I wanted to show here is, and I've seen the evolution of Orbit is that now sustainability is both implicit and explicit within our strategy. So you can see there in one of the outer rings, that explicit commitment. And if you were to go on our website and look at the launch of our strategy, net zero carbon is the third element that's talked about. So it is really important that we build sustainability in to our corporate strategies. And I think as board members, we need to be asking those questions when we're having those discussions with our exec. Where is sustainability? How does that feature in our longer term strategies? Next slide, please. As I said, if we had a half an hour, 2 hours, we could just spend it on this slide. And Adam talked about this earlier. And I think it's important that we all take an opportunity to learn this, because a lot of us are coming to sustainability, environmental sustainability, later in our careers. This isn't talked about. It wasn't part of my professional qualification that I did. So, if anything you do after today, go away, stick these in Google. What does this tell you? What are you learning about environment? Go on that personal journey. If not, if you like your podcast, the BBC Climate Change podcast is really important. Find good third-party organisations that can help you unlock net zero as well. But we need to really make sure that these words, there's nothing hocus pocus about this. This is really important business language. As board members and executives, we need to understand what they are, what they mean, and how we can use them within our strategies. Next slide, please. I'm trying to, I guess, in these last two slides, and just 2 or 3 slides, God, the time flies so quickly, doesn't it? Is to talk about actually the practical things we can do, both as executives and non-executives. And you have this two elements. So the mitigation is that decarbonisation and actually that kind of compensation, maybe the offsetting. We need to be thinking about offsetting. That's a big opportunity for housing organisations. We've got a lot of land. So what about planting those orchards that maybe in 5, 10, 15 years time might be giving us a carbon offsetting opportunity as those credits get more and more expensive? But that's a conversation for another day. I think Adam talked again about the impact of flooding. So do you have a flood risk plan? This is the problem of today. You know, do your grounds maintenance contracts really make sure that the drains are cleared, the water areas are, we had this on one estate where actually at Orbit we had a flood, and actually when we look back at what could have helped, it wouldn't have solved it. What could have helped was actually clearance of vegetation and growth from one of the drains. So I think we've got to think about that, identify flood risk areas, insurance. It's going to be a risk. So I suppose what I'm trying to say here is all those things Adam talked about, we're having to now put into our risk management plan as an issue today. It's not going to happen tomorrow. These things are happening on a daily, and these are our customers' homes and our customers' health that we're looking at as well. Okay, next slide, please. You'll get to see these afterwards. I suppose it is important that you do measure and also celebrate success. So we do measure our scope 1 and 2 journey, our carbon footprint. You can see the reduction. That the challenge is that big purple line, and what's those? Those are all the communal gas boilers we've got in our schemes. We can't get rid of those overnight, and I think as Emma alluded to, the disparity between electricity and gas prices and the tax situation needs to be sorted out. But it's going to take us a long time to move. But you can see the journey that we've made, and I suppose it is making sure that we are demonstrating to our staff, our customers, and our stakeholders we're doing that. But obviously the EPC journey that we're all working on, and that first milestone of 2030, you know, we're making really good strides towards that. But I think, as Emma's pointed out, we've got to go way beyond EPCC, and I think we're building new homes to EPCB. Well, how long before we're going to have to, rip out those new gas boilers and replace them? So I think there's a really, and I think Emma brought those discussions really to life. Okay, so my last slide, and again, this is I guess something that you can do as board members at exec to think about at maybe your next board meeting. Are we asking the questions at the table? There's lots of competing pressures, and I know that. I just had a board meeting last week, but we have got to think about sustainability. It is a root cause behind a lot of the issues we're facing today. It's about how we make that link, how we educate ourselves to understand that. And you'll find around the table, people are at different stages. I hope we don't have any more climate deniers out there. I think Adam made the case that we should all know about, but you never know where people are and colleagues are. But I think it is making sure we're clear on what is our ambition. And for every organisation, it's going to be a different challenge. It's going to be a different challenge, and we have to unpick our way through that and get the help that we need to do that, and make sure that we're getting that right reporting back to board and the measures that can help us understand where we go on this. So yeah, I think my last message is these webinars are absolutely brilliant. We need more time. We took all of our execs through 2 significant sessions. We call them sustainability summits this year, and really spent time exploring some of this with external experts, going through the detail of this, because we need to help educate people. We've got a board away day later in this year as well, but I think it's things we need to do personally as well. And if you're not spending time thinking about sustainability, take the opportunity, as I said, whether it's a podcast or a lazy half an hour on Google looking at some of the words I put into this. Please take the opportunity to do so. We need to work together as a sector. There is hope, but we need to act quickly, and really that's on behalf of our customers as well. So hopefully that's been useful, and we look forward to your questions.
Julian, thank you. Really interesting insight from inside a large landlord that's made significant steps. I wonder if you could just reflect for a minute on how the same external context, how it's felt sat at the board table in Tuntum.
Great question. We had this conversation the other day. We have an environmental policy. We were reviewing this as you would do all the environmental policies. And, I think the question is, it's great having a policy, but how are we actually putting that into practice. You know, we're very strong on health and safety, but do we have our environmental management systems? But TomTom's really small. We're looking at decarbonisation, the cost of decarbonisation to us. We are going to need significant help. Maybe Orbit can look at a different way of finding that, and that's before we get on to things such as you know, biodiversity. So I think at TomTom, you know, where, you know, costs are tighter, we're much closer on our headroom and our covenants. The choices are different that Orbit's got to make, but I think at least having that conversation and understanding where do you start, where can you make that short-term impact, I guess, as well as setting out that longer. But I think unless there's significant government help for the smaller organisations, I do worry about our ability to take this forward.
And how straightforward has it been? Did you notice a difference in the quality of engagement by the board with the subject than if the subject was one of the more long-standing traditional subjects of planned works or an asset management strategy or such things?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, I just put a few of the jargon busting terms up there, and people sort of look at them and think, well, I don't really know what that means. I don't know my scope 1 from a scope 2, my scope 3. I don't really know what net zero carbon means. And I think actually we've got to help our boards and educate our boards, take them on the journey, and, you know, to help them understand this. And I've done this over the last 3 or 4 years in running this area. This area was given to me. I'm not an environmentalist by trade. And you have to learn this and understand and ask loads of questions. And I think boards will need to look at their skills matrix and say, actually, they probably need somebody on there with a background, but actually, how do we train boards in sustainability? Because as you said, it's not just an environmental issue, it's a social issue as well.
Yes, and I'd want to represent as well quite strongly the view that so I think it will be important to get a degree of sustainability expertise in one person on the board, but that runs the risk. We will have all been in meetings where when the relevant subject comes up, whether it's sustainability or development or asset management or finance, all the heads in the room turn to look at one person.
I agree.
And that one person then tells the organization what the organization thinks about that thing. And that's not good governance. It's not to say that there's not a part for expertise, but it is to say that in addition to that, it's really important that non-subject matter experts have techniques that they can use to get under the skin of technical subject matter. And we're great proponents of that at CT. So let's open it out for some questions. We've had some really good questions, some of which other attendees have taken the time to answer in the chat, and thank you very much for that. Some of which I've got written down in front of me here. So let's get stuck into some of these. This is a cracking opening one. I'm afraid I've cut and pasted them out, so I can't credit the people who asked them, and I do apologise. But please, whoever asked this question, let your chest swell slightly with pride, because it's a really good one. So it's for all three of you. We'll start perhaps with Emma. In your opinion, where can a housing organisation have the biggest impact on sustainability, both for residents' lives and on mitigating climate change impacts?
That is a very good question. I think for me, it would be looking at, you know, this is more focused, I suppose, on new build for me, because that's the area I focused on. But I think for me, it would be moving away from just looking at building regulations compliance and working towards those new metrics that I mentioned in my earlier slide. You may not get there straight away, but starting to work towards thinking about building to low carbon energy standards. So thinking about space heating demand and energy use intensity. I think if we couch things in terms of carbon, that doesn't help us. I think we need to use those new metrics. They are relatively straightforward metrics to work to. There's lots of guidance out there. So yeah, I think for me, that would be my #1 top priority. And I am going to have to apologise. I need to jump off the call now,
No,
unfortunately.
of course you do. Well,
Because I've
just as
got
well I came to you first, Emma. We got
Yes.
one last gem of insight
Yeah,
before you disappeared.
apologies. It's been a really interesting webinar, and I'm sorry I have to leave you, but I think you're in very capable hands with Jon and Adam and Julian. So yeah, thank you
Emma,
very
thank
much.
you very much indeed.
Thanks.
So Julian, what are your thoughts on the same question?
Oh, I mean, I think you can't turn too far away from, our customers' homes. We've got to reduce the cost of heating and the energy costs of those homes. So I think that would be my first point of call. I did, because I thought that would be the obvious answer. I was going to just throw in a second one. We've done a lot of work around biodiversity on our estates, and I think actually, we all look outside of our windows, and we know in the COVID crisis how important communal shared spaces was. And actually, if we can do something around biodiversity and making our spaces not just concrete and cut grass, and make them more attractive actually from an environmental point of view, but places where we want to live and it proud of. And we've got this commitment. I'd urge everyone to do it. It's with the Wildlife Trust, 30% of our open space will be supporting nature's recovery by 2030. That's a commitment we've made. We're at about 17%, so we've got a lot of work to do, but it's actually driving that agenda, and it's raising awareness with our residents of what we're trying to do practically around climate change. But I guess you cannot ignore the customers' homes, and the cost of those homes, I think, would still be my focus.
That's really, thank you. Very interesting. So I've worked in social housing since 1985, and I can honestly say that we were almost at 2020 before anybody in asset management started talking about cost in use for residents. So we've spent a long time looking after buildings, and we have looked after them moderately well within cost limits. But we, as a sector, we have not been particularly interested in cost in use for residents until the last 5 years. So it's fantastic that it is now very much rising up the agenda. Of course, the fuel cost crisis contributed to that. But we know that we house people who are in the least well off third of the population, and yet only now are we starting to think, well, perhaps, I mean, we've done, let's be clear, we bunged insulation in, but we did that because there was a program and it was made cost effective for us to do it. We didn't do it. We didn't run programs to enable residents to use their homes more economically, for example, which is one of the biggest ways you can make an impact. Anyway, enough of my
Jon, just on that, Jon, I mean, I think if that's a whole nother topic, but the concept of a warm rent, tying rents to EPC levels, and actually looking at the whole cost of a property, I think is debate for another time. But it's one we've got to seriously think about, because if you get a passive house through the allocation system, or you get EPCD, the cost of your monthly bill will be significantly different, but you might be paying the same rent because it's the same archetype. So I think we just got to think. We've got to think very clearly about how that features in our future rent setting, but that's for another day.
Yeah. It's the top of another interesting cul-de-sac. Adam, back to the original question. Where can a housing organisation have the biggest impact on sustainability?
Great question. And I think it highlights the complexity of the issue. I think we've got to go back to the basics. And I think what we're hearing in the presentations and the discussions is that this is a complex area. So awareness is really, really critical. And that's not just awareness at board level, officer level. That's actually awareness at housing officer level, community officer level, and engaging with the communities that we're looking after. There's some really good examples of communities dealing with topics, issues as a group, and actually by helping them understand some of the topics and increasing the awareness, you get actually greater engagement and resolutions, and they are can be very highly accessible. I could talk a lot about what I did with the Marmalade Lane co-housing project in Cambridge as a really good example about coming together and doing things collectively. The awareness part then fits part of the strategy, and I think what I do encourage people to go away and think about is, what do you have in place at the moment? Is it a net zero policy? Is it a net zero strategy? Or is it a proper sustainability strategy, as Julian's brilliantly described what's been done at Orbit? Because I think that has to be the starting point. We need that. We need the data, because the solutions might not be the same. And I think that's critical. You've got to make it very relevant to your organization, your stock, and your customers. And so they're the key things I think you need to kind of start with.
Lovely. Thank you. I'm going to pose now the question, the most asked question. It's been asked 3 times in different forms. And it is, let's start with you this time, if we may, Adam. How do we find the balance between sustainability and delivering more homes?
Classic question, isn't it? Where do you put the resource? I suppose it's a combination. It has to be a combination, because we have a housing crisis. We have people in homelessness situation, all that stuff. I think we know we need to build more homes. So it is critical. I think what we heard from Emma is understanding that actually the role of our partners, organisations like Homes England, like local authorities, like the planning organisations, really need to come in here to set some very clear guidance, regulations, etc. If we have a system on the new builds, if we allow the current system to deliver just the building regs, then we've got a major problem. And I think as an industry and as a sector, we need to really be pushing back to say, look, we can't do this on our own. We actually need intervention from government level to bluntly change the sector and change the market. Now, there will be a lot of uproar about that from a number of house builders, but we have to take that on the chin. We have to challenge and do it. On the other side, organisations have budgets. You have, I hope you have, long-term maintenance budgets, long-term investment budgets. So understanding what your property condition is and how it's functioning and how your customers are being served, I think is business as usual. What the trick is to switch it so that actually you don't just go into a property and take a boiler out. You actually have a proper plan, a longer term plan with an investment associated with it, and then deal with those properties in a way which actually meets a higher standard. So it is a combination. But as I say, I think that the former new development way, we actually need greater intervention at a regulatory level.
Lovely. Julian, I'll come to you in just a second with the same question. I guess my observation is that about 3 years after the fire at Grenfell, many chief execs walked down the corridor for the first time and went into the development director's office and said, we need to talk about your budget. Because, historically, we, as a sector, we've prioritised more and more units over the implicit quality of their units. And the sustainability agenda, is adjacent to that and also wanting more of that. Well, they inevitably, a more sustainable home costs more than a less sustainable home. And so there's a further trade-off that we're needing to think about when we all know that the budgets are thoroughly under pressure, and we all know that the demand for new units is never going to be fully met. So I wonder, Julian, within that context, where the subject lands in Orbit.
Well, it's great listening to us, and we had very much this conversation with our development team as part of one of our sustainability summits. I think the Future Home Standard will really help, because I think the point that they were making on this is all the while there's, housing associations want to try and do the right thing. We'd love to put photovoltaics on there. We'd like to, push the boundary beyond the basic requirements. But if you're up against the bidding on a land where somebody else can do something different, there's not that level playing field. So I think what they were talking about was actually the Future Home Standard requires a level playing field across the board. This just becomes what we build. Okay, we might be able to build slightly less homes, but we'll all be building to the same standard. I think that's the point they made, that we can make more whilst we're trying to do things above and beyond. That I think that's going to be difficult. So I think it'll be interesting to see, and I think that's got broad support across obviously both parties. So it'll be interesting to see where that land. I think the point Adam made about, we've got to use existing budgets that we have in a smart way. I'm going to see a customer on Friday morning, and he's very much, some of the things he wants would be solved by a retrofit program. The danger is we don't want to do a little bit here and a little bit there. We've got to have a kind of a coordinated approach. And I think that's how we get the best value from the small pots that we have.
Lovely. Thank you. A very quick last question, because it needs to be quick because we're running out of time, not because it is a niche question, but I'm really keen that I ask it. But it's rushed because of time limits, not for any other reason. And it's just this. How does this affect small housing co-ops? So, Adam and Julian, you both spend your time on issues that are, tend to be on larger numbers of properties. Just a couple of tips each, if you could, on what a small housing co-op might be doing. Adam, go first.
So, great question. I would say it's the same. Every business, every organization should be considering this topic, and embed and creating a strategy that's relevant to that business. So there's no difference in between Julian and Orbit and Clarion and whatever. Everybody should be dealing with it, but you make it relevant to that business. And the beauty of a cooperative, if I understand where the question's coming from, and the ability that the people who have a vested interest or shareholding in the operation of their organization, perfect. So you're actually embedding people into the conversation and the solutions who are living in those properties. So I don't think I just don't think it needs to be any more complex, any different. It just needs to be embedded in what you do.
Yeah, I think just before I come to you, Julian, I think the observation I make on that is it definitely doesn't need to be more complex. But I think if you are a resident in a small co-op, it feels incredibly complex compared to the scale of the teams that might be engaging with the subject in a Clarion or an Orbit or a. Do you know what I mean? It's a much tougher ask, I think, to get your head around the issues. Julian, your observations?
Yeah, I mean, I think Adam's absolutely right. Whatever size, you need a plan that's appropriate and understanding those priorities and how it fits in your corporate strategy. I went to the Housing Summit last week. I listened to a really interesting presentation by a collaboration between a lot of Northwest, very small housing organisations. And I think this is definitely one of those where, if you're in your area, talk to other small organisations. Or can you collaborate? Can you, between you, do something where you help get that expertise, whether that's through a self-funded post, working with a consultancy, to actually help, because there's no way you're going to be able to get the level of expertise. Obviously, we're very lucky at Orbit, but actually collaborate and get some support with others so that it helps you chart that course forward. That would be my tip.
Thank you very much. So I'll just attempt it. Well, first of all, I must thank both Julian and Adam and Emma in her absence for some really informative stuff. I guess my takeaways are, for one thing, don't worry that the start of this journey might feel clunky. It's a bit like learning to drive. Those first 3 lessons feel unimaginably difficult, and then slowly but surely it gets better. And I know that personally, as an adult, I find it harder to start new things because of that fear of being that clunky new learner at a later stage in life. But the imperatives are such that we can't simply decide not to try, would be one observation. I've been struck by the fact that there's lots of resources out there, and there's a willingness to share. And the Good Homes Alliance, an example of that, but there's tons of others too. It is made more complicated, as we've just talked about in the last answer, by the fact that there aren't clear standards that say, right, the government has said this is how it's going to be, and so now we all know what the flag is on the horizon that we're marching towards. At the moment, there's a plethora of flags, and they're on a range of different horizons, and you've got to pick one. And some organisations are struggling to pick a flag and struggling to start the journey. Something we haven't talked about much, but I would really encourage you to think about, Julian, you mentioned it briefly, is to really, really look for the joins. Sustainability is not a thing done in one office by two people that are separate from the rest of the organisation. Sustainability needs to be considered when there's no way that you should be doing programs of window replacement without thinking about the broader sustainability agenda and how what you're doing fits into that broader agenda. For some organizations, that has completely reinvented how they go about planned works. So look for those joins all the time, between development and sustainability, between your staffing and sustainability. If you're a medium-sized organization, you're running a fleet of vans. How are they fueled? What are the working patterns like? All those sorts of issues. And think about it through your procurement channels as well. How is your approach to sustainability reflected in the way that you procure stuff? What responsibilities are you seeking to pass through to contractors, for example, for local labour rather than long distance labour, local parts rather than long distance parts? I guess perhaps coming away from the details slightly, I noticed that it took Grenfell for us to pay attention to the fire safety issue. So our reaction, the changes we see to fire safety and building safety are because of something bad that happened. And sustainability is the exact opposite of that. It's the threat of a bad thing happening in the future, and we need to decide to act now upon it. And I just think that's, but I would say it's no less important. But sometimes it gets pushed down the agenda because it's a risk tomorrow rather than today. I was struck by the fact that sustainability literacy is a way to create momentum. So just getting people talking about the subject, both at board and in staff teams, can make a real difference. I think those were the things the observations I wanted to make just in closing out. We've hit our time limit. Oh, we're 3 minutes over. I do apologise. I've talked too much. So thank you to everybody who's contributed. Thank you for attending. We hope you found it useful. I understand there's a survey, so you can tell us how we did. Thank you very much. Goodbye.